I assume you can see the slides now. And
that's fine. It's fine.
Good. And so this is actually the homepage of Scientists Warning Europe. I clipped it on there. There's a tiny modification, but I like the approach. I like the tenor because I feel that we, and when I say we, I mean environmental scientists, sustainability communications people, and those concerned about posterity. I'm afraid that we've fallen into this what we might call the image protection syndrome, where a lot of us have become really obsessed with a so-called positive approach, and we've adopted kind of an unbalanced emphasis on so-called solutions. Sometimes they're often pretty questionable. And so what we're doing is we're leaving the heavy lifting of the dire heralding to others. And it's as if we're afraid of, in the mirror, looking like Cassandra, like a Cassandra that's constantly warning about, dire scenarios right down the road. And as an overreaction to that fear, we end up looking like Pollyanna instead. And so, drinking the green Kool-Aid kind of thing. And so that's why I like the approach of Scientists Warning. They don't do that. And in fact, here's a solution. You might say from outside the box, at least from outside that image protection syndrome box. We should be emphasizing the problems and sounding the alarm. And so you do that at Scientists Warning, and we do a little bit of that at CASI too. We try to take a balanced approach with warnings and solutions. But this is a clip of our homepage. And now I want to go back to the screen sharing if I can figure out how to do that. Now I want to show you a little video clip, I guess we'd call it, that used to be our homepage, and see what you think of this. Yeah, so it ends up with the offer to folks to sign the position, which is done here. And this leads you to the position that you can sign that helps to warn people, the public and policymakers, that there are limits to growth. There is a limit to economic growth, and growth is starting to cause more problems than it solves. So thank you for your patience in me getting to that spot. Now I'm going to stop that share and go back to the slides. And we'll start back in that spot and move on with the with some of the ecological macroeconomics of the talk. So we know that economic growth isn't sustainable. At some point it hits this carrying capacity, as we'd call it in ecology. And of course, perpetual degrowth wouldn't be sustainable either. And so the sustainable alternative then is what we call the steady state economy. And it cannot be a flatlined economy. It'd be fluctuating, hopefully mildly fluctuating without shocks, and ideally fluctuating around some optimum level. And I think it always helps to remind ourselves exactly what economic growth is when we start talking about growth and limits to growth. Economic growth is simply an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so it's typically expressed in terms of GDP, or gross domestic product. and it entails the increasing population and or per capita production and consumption. So steady state economy is all of that except stabilized instead of growing. And now, so we're starting with that, and then, oh, that also explains our logo at Cassie. You see the sigmoid growth curve of the economy flattening out with, by the way, what E.O. Wilson would communicate as half Earth, trying to save half Earth, which of course it's far too late for that already, for biodiversity. But it's not viewed this way in conventional economic growth theory. You know, conventional economics, especially growth theory, is centered around this production function that tells us that production is a function of capital and labor. They leave out land entirely. There's a long story behind this, political and technical. But as a result of that, what we might call the landless production function, we have in basic econ textbooks as well as business curricula, this vision of the economy as a circular flow of money between businesses and households. And that's for the labor and the products, conversely. And if your vision of the economy is like that, well, how would you think about the process of economic growth? You just kind of think about it like this. It's a perpetually growing circular flow of money. And of course, in ecological macroeconomics, we start actually with the context, evolutionarily and physically and biologically. And so we know that first there was planet Earth, and yes, sun providing energy to Earth and allowing for the growth of the ecosystems on planet Earth. And then humans evolved and were created, and then the economy starts. And yes, you do have a circular flow of money, but it does always require land and the natural resources thereon and the natural capital, the woods, the waters, the soils, the minerals, fisheries, and so on. And because of the second two laws, because of the laws of thermodynamics, the second law in particular, there are pollutants in the form of waste material and heat as well, waste heat. So that's why we have limits to growth. So we know that there's some limit to the growth of this economy. So now we have another question to address, and this one is where the controversy starts. Does that mean then that there's a limit to GDP? Now we've already have a hint at this because we defined economic growth clearly. That's one of the reasons we did that. And we said how it's indicated by GDP, and it's actually more than just indicated it. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we're going to address this question and also recognize that GDP is put in monetary terms. So then that brings up another interesting question. Can we express limits to growth in terms of money? And that's what I want to talk about next. So, you know, we know that money is a means of exchange. It's a unit of account. It's a store of value. But and what we don't often pay attention to is that in the economy, money exists as a stock and a flow. That's the money supply, and the main flow, the flow that we're most concerned with, is GDP. And let me explain why we view that as a flow. GDP is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. That's the standard application of GDP. And this is what's called the fundamental identity of national income accounting. Production equals income equals expenditure. These are the three approaches for calculating GDP. And these are clear, and these two, by the way, do reflect flow of the circular flow of money, and these clearly are flows. Expenditure of one is income of another. But again, now it's not the expenditure on anything, it's the production of final goods and services, the income from final goods and services, the expenditure on final goods and services. It's the loaves of bread, not the wheat and the salt that went into the baking of those loaves. And here's a way to drive that point home. It's not every transaction out there. This doesn't contribute to GDP. The wages of the casino staff do, but not, not pulling that handle. And similarly, all the transactions for purposes of investing in derivatives on the trading floor, that doesn't go into GDP. So right away, we can see that GDP reflects the real economy. Now, I want to talk just briefly about the origins of money, because like Aristotle said, he who thus considers things in their first growth and origin will obtain the clearest view of them. So what about money? Well, we know that the origins of money were in these three places, especially Mesopotamia, Lydia in ancient Greece, and China, where shekels and coins of electrum, which is a natural alloy of silver and gold, and copper coins, respectively, came into being from 5,000 to about 2,200 years ago. And we also know that in these regions, as with other regions where money later evolved, there were typically forms of what we might call proto-money, and you can see some of the most famously barley grains in Mesopotamia, where in Sumerian barley is called sheh, and so that's the origin of the shekel. It started out as 160 grains of barley, but anyway, throughout those regions where money evolved, there were natural resource forms, often agricultural and extractive, as proto-money. And let's dig back a little bit further yet then, thinking about the origins of money, and we find that it's no coincidence then that these same regions are also famous anthropologically, archaeologically, and evolutionarily as originating another thing, and that's agriculture. And so that leads us then to what we call at Cassie the trophic theory of money. Money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor unto the manufacturing and service sectors. Trophic theory of money. Why do we call it the trophic theory? Well, we're using principles of ecology, and we recognize that in the economy of nature, we have these three main trophic levels. It starts with the producers at the base. These are the plants that literally produce food in the process of photosynthesis. When you have enough of that, enough surplus production, then you can have populations of primary consumers, those species that eat directly the producers, the plants. And when there's enough of that, then you can have secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers. And of course, you can have intermediate levels. You can have omnivores that eat some primary consumers and plants. And throughout this economy of nature, you also have some species that aren't so readily recognized as occupying trophic levels, service providers like scavengers, for example, and decomposers. But most of the service provision in the economy of nature is provided by and among these trophic levels as well. Primary consumers also in many cases function as pollinators, for example, in their life history. With the human economy, it has to follow the same basic rules, and we sure have a trophic structure as well there that starts with the producers at the base. And this has been known and discussed in one way or another no later than with Francois Quesnay and the physiocrats in 1750s to 1780s France, especially with Quesnay's Tableau économique. But we need to get back to a focus on that with ecological macroeconomics and recognize that you don't have any heavy manufacturing unless you have surplus at the base of agro-extractive activity. And you certainly don't have any light manufacturing without having the heavier manufacturing. And due to the technological proliferation of Homo sapiens, we do have service sectors that are very identifiable and distinguished in that sense of providing services, but they too are constantly interacting as an integral element of this basic trophic structure. So the primary corollary of the trophic theory of money is that the quantity of money and GDP as that flow of money indicates the amount of agricultural surplus and related activity at the trophic base, and therefore the environmental impact of the economy. It's one of the main points of the talk. GDP indicates the environmental impact of the economy. Remember, here was our definition, and we didn't spend much time emphasizing this phrase in the aggregate, but it's really a key phrase because economic growth, it's not just more organic vegetables here and less Roundup Ready soybeans there. It's a growth of that trophically structured macro economy. It's a growth of the integrated whole. It's a macroeconomic process. So there it is. That's a little more relevant view in the 21st century of economic growth. It's not a circular flow of money going out into nothingness. It's this trophic structure expanding at the base, expanding, and we'll see what that means in real life now. And yeah, we have some time to talk a little bit about these. We have extremely industrial agriculture at this point with that 76 trillion dollar global economy that the rolling GDP meter indicated before. We're up to things like this really heavy industrial kind of agriculture, which biologically is extremely vulnerable because this is such a simplistic ecosystem and that requires tremendous amounts of inputs in terms of energy and fertilizers and chemicals. Here's how that plays out in terms of water needs. This is what you see if you look down from flying over the state of Kansas, and that's what it is on the ground. It's this pivot agriculture. It's pivot irrigation that's extracting water from the Oglala aquifer, which we know is going to be running dry. At the edges, it already is. In marginal portions, it is. And here's what that pivot agriculture looks like from the air in Saudi Arabia. There's what it looks like on the ground in that region. But anywhere where there's aquifer drying, drought as a result of climate change, or just overuse of water for other purposes, this is what starts to happen to soils and crops. And in fact, when we look around the world, it doesn't have to be in places where we have to be draining those fossil aquifers. It's places where water would seem to be plentiful at first glance, and always was considered plentiful in the 20th century. But now we're finding that there's water stress even where there's plenty of water, where there had been supposedly plenty of water, if there are any soils in that area to practice agriculture. And, you know, moving out from the basic crop production, we have the domestic livestock production as well. causing such overgrazing problems in the American West, for example, and many other regions in the world. And accounting, by the way, in the case of domestic livestock production for beef and dairy, using about, I want to say it's 55% of the water that's consumed in California. And of course, these are heavily polluting industries, these livestock production sectors, and very disease prone as well. And then moving out a little bit further from the food production itself, we have the other extractive sectors such as logging. And as that economy grows, the more intensive these extractive activities have to get. And so you get this clear-cut type of logging, you get this open pit type of mining, and so on. And it's only when there's plenty of that kind of activity that you can have plenty of heavy manufacturing. These kinds of operations, which are very energy intensive and very fossil fuel combusting. And when we think about heavy manufacturing, I suppose that's the time also to think about the infrastructure. This is some heavy manufacturing for purposes of moving the labor and the product and transmitting the energy and the water to conduct all these economic activities. When there's plenty of that, then you can have plenty of light manufacturing as well. And certainly not going to go through very many examples at all, but everybody knows what light manufacturing is: production of little stuff, including even the little containers required to ship the little stuff. Think of all those Amazon boxes right now. And all the way up to the lightest manufacturing, such as a computer chip manufacturing, which then you could say grades into a particular service sector that we call information services. And we should talk about this briefly because for some time, and I suppose still in some circles, there's this fuzzy notion that we can somehow dematerialize the economy by going to more and more of this activity relative to these other earlier activities. And the thing that we should recognize with the service of information provision is that how is it going to be how will it be relevant to GDP growth unless it's serving all those other sectors? So if you investigate what these folks are doing, they invariably are having something to do with the other trophic structures that we already looked at, starting at the trophic base of heavy extraction and agriculture. Which brings us to the energy sector, which in some ways we could consider the ultimate base of the economy, because none of those activities really transpire without all this energy. I prefer to consider agriculture the base because that is the economic activity that ties in most directly with the economy of nature and its base and the function of photosynthesis. But it certainly is the case that with the heavy industrialized agriculture that we have today, as well as all those other sectors, we have to have all this. And of course, there's this hope out there that there will be more and more of this and less of like the tar sands in Alberta and these massive dams that aren't sustainable in the long run because of sedimentation and so on. But I don't know, maybe we should be careful what we wish for, because how's that starting to look as mountain ranges and valleys fill up with these things? And then also when you consider that the economy grows via the liquidation of that natural capital that had earlier provided habitats or comprised wildlife habitats, well, then having more and more of this stuff is kind of like having a bigger gun to shoot yourself in the foot with. And furthermore, if you're hell bent on GDP growth, like say, like Donald Trump was or has been as president, then you're not even going to settle for that. You're going to want all of this. So it's just the wrong goal for the 21st century, and I think that ought to be maybe one of the biggest messages that scientists warn publics and policymakers with. But yeah, and of course, in the economic production process, they're pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics, is going to be a tailpipe, and all else equal, the stuff coming out of it is greater as the economy grows. Doesn't mean it's going to be greater per capita. It can actually decline per capita, but it continues to increase in the gross as GDP grows. We'll be covering that shortly. But I think we have a pretty good knowledge now that GDP, as that flow of money, can be used itself to indicate the carrying capacity of the economy. And when we go back to that earlier diagram, the ecological macroeconomic vision of growth, well, which was like this, remember, we might want to just replace this circular flow of money with a little more complete vision of the economy, and we would be looking at it then like this, where this trophic structure is growing. See the trophic base expanding across the earth, so more and more natural capital is being liquidated in these activities to feed these and those, and there's more of this. Okay, so about the only response to that that's worth any consideration, and it's the only response there is really out there to that, by those who would claim that no, there's no limit to growth, and no, there's no fundamental conflict between growth and environmental protection or conservation of resources. They would say, well, what about technological progress? So let's think about that. And the way to look at it's kind of like with those origins of money. We need to know how it really happens, how it originates, where it came from. And we know that, of course, we need research and development to progress technologically. And what that means in an economic context, to clarify, is more output per unit input. So it's a greater productive efficiency. And it takes research and development. And oftentimes, like in Washington, D.C. conferences, when it's not COVID-19 pandemic time, there's a lot of talk about, we have to invest in more R&D so we can have more technological progress so we can solve all these problems. Well, the discussion is pretty shallow. It doesn't really consider where that R&D comes from. So let's look at that next. And of course, it takes profits in the private sector and economic surplus in the public sector to fund the R&D. It's only after the factors of production have been paid off, the wages and the interest and the rents and so on, that there's any chance of R&D. And then there's the dividends that go to the shareholders and the corporate parties in Atlanta and so on. You have to get past all of that to have some research and development happen. And most of the public finance, of course, comes from the private sector to begin with in taxes. So this is a questionable thing. It's sort of like it takes the R&D to maintain the profits, but you have to have profits to maintain the R&D. This is kind of a catch-22 that, excuse me, I am not taking too much time to explain here, but if you, read our stuff on this, it's explained pretty thoroughly. Basically, I'll tell you in a nutshell, in conventional and any relevant economics, profits dry up. It's it's a standard function with the iron law of wages and so on. Profits dry up, except for those firms that are able to maintain some competitive advantage over the others. And the way that happens is, the stock answer for how that happens is, well, they conduct research and development. So that's how you wind up with sort of a catch-22. And what's always missed is what's at the very base that sort of disengages that catch-22 and allows for all of this to happen in an ongoing manner, at least until limits to growth are encountered. And it's called economies of scale, which are simply reductions in the average cost of product resulting from increased level of output. But the key point here is that this increased output occurs at existing levels of technology. So yes, there's increased efficiency. It's economies of scale that are not just concurrently, but concomitantly, with an increase in aggregate throughput. That's the key phrase, increase in aggregate throughput. So here's an example of economies of scale. It's the same basic level of technology, internal combustion engine, single draft hull, same, even similar types of containers. Same basic level of 20th, 21st century technology. But of course, this operation is way more efficient in terms of product transported per unit of energy than that is. And I think it's pretty obvious which one is more sustainable. So sustainability is all about the size of the operation ultimately. And with that, I'll just say a few words about optimum scale and we'll wrap it up. So we, toward the beginning, displayed this, recognizing that neither growth nor degrowth are sustainable. That leaves the steady state economy, and I may want to put it this way, like in a tweet or something, but you have to wonder a little bit about this, because I don't know, we're at that 70-some trillion dollar, which by the way was almost up to 89 trillion. If you were very, very observant when the GDP meter was rolling on your screen before, you would have noticed is that we have it rolling backwards right now as a function of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we probably won't readjust it to be running back forward until there's vaccination or a longer period of recession. So is it happy times at this, let's say the current level of GDP? Is that the optimal level? Well, we consider this at CASI to be the biggest question for democracy in the 21st century. How do we democratically account for the preferences of, say, people like me? I think I would have preferred the world, I did prefer the world with a much lesser GDP. I'm a wildlife biologist originally. I love being out in the wilderness areas and so on. And I find those places disappearing, and I find so much pollution and invasive species and noise and traffic. I don't like this level of GDP. But we do have a lot of other people. First of all, they never got to see it down at these lower levels, so they don't know what they're missing. They only know what they see now. And there are folks that just by their nature would prefer, I suppose, in the entire Europe and North America and planet to be like one giant London or New York City or Beijing. So I say that this is the biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century, is to figure out how to get to a relatively optimal level, all people and all things considered, nationally and globally. To do that, it helps to have some metrics that sort of progress from just the sheer size of the economy to measures that start to get at the health of things, the Living Planet Index, Human Development Index, this one, Genuine Progress Indicator, until finally you're looking at sort of the bottom line, happiness. So, the economy shouldn't be for its own sake. It should be for the sake of people's well-being and happiness. And so I think I'll just close this out, going for full circle when we recognize that, well, maybe there's a little bit too much focus these days on solutions, and so much of an effort to get to solutions sometimes are kind of sloppy solutions like oxymoronic green growth or sustainable growth. Those aren't solutions at all. When we recognize that the only sustainable alternative is the steady state economy. But I'll just leave the tip of the iceberg in what we can do. First of all, we can do less. And of course, what we mean by that is, buying less, consuming less, building less, driving less, heating less, heating, especially the wasteful ways like the outdoor heating in restaurants, things like that can be trimmed off, the fat that can be trimmed off the economy most readily. So it's kind of a sardonic sort of answer to that question, but something to think about. But while you're doing less, we still want you to read more. And there are any number of great books we could pitch here. So I decided just to mention that these are the last two off the Steady State Press. At Cassie, we have an imprint called the Steady State Press. And when you join Cassie, you can join Cassie and we'll send you a copy of Best of the Daily News. These are really great little articles. We consider this kind of a primer on ecological macroeconomics. This one just came off the press literally last week. And it is what it says. It's all about the shortcomings of the human mind in an evolutionary sense, primarily for handling big picture, long-term challenges like limits to growth and climate change and biodiversity loss. It's uncommon sense. We need to try to help spread it around and replace all that, the banality around, consumer confidence. And otherwise, you could start by signing the Cassie position on economic growth at steadystate.org, which really helps to precipitate the paradigm shifts and to pursue the policy reforms. And we'd love to talk with you about the specific examples of that anytime you're ready. And it helps us to advance the steady state economy for environmental protection, economic sustainability, and yes, national security and international stability. Thank you very much.